Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another live panel discussion brought to you by the VLGA and LGPro. It is terrific to see so many of you with us, and there's still a few more to come. So as people come in and get settled, we'll make a start. I'll introduce our panelists very, very shortly. But firstly, I would like to, in the spirit of reconciliation, acknowledge on behalf of the VLGA and LGPro, the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Governance is the hot topic of the day as new councils are being announced and will very soon be sworn in. The process of induction will commence in earnest. And we'd like to help with that today, giving you a few things to think about. And Catherine Arndt, firstly, will set the scene, CEO of the VLGA. Good afternoon, Catherine. How are you?
Good afternoon, Chris, and thank you for that welcome. And on behalf of the VLGA and LGPro, I welcome all of you today. The topic of today's discussion is governance rules and building trust. So it builds upon the panel that some of you may have attended last week, which was looking at the role of the Mayor in particular and how that was so much more than just a title. And hopefully you had some good takeaways from that. And we're talking today as we're waiting with anticipation for the final results of the local government elections that are coming in as we speak. I think over 80% of the results have been announced to date. So congratulations to those councillors elect who may be in the room today, and also best of luck for those who may still be waiting to hear the results. The VLGA is absolutely delighted to be again working in collaboration with LGPro to bring this discussion with you, and we're very pleased to have the Chief Municipal Inspector, Dr. John Lynch, and also Ross Millard with us today, along with Blaga and Steve. Chris will introduce all of our panel in more detail shortly. Today is really talking about moving beyond compliance to building trust and relationships. And we have the benefit, I guess, of having a diverse panel of speakers who can come at this topic from a number of different angles. John and Ross, of course, will speak to the compliance element and the importance of this for ensuring and maintaining the integrity of our democratic system of local governance and government. Blaga, of course, will talk from a governance officer's perspective and some of her experiences working with a councillor group, and particularly the opportunities that are here as we are welcoming in and inducting a new councillor group very shortly. And of course, Steve will speak to all of those things as well, but talk a little bit more about moving towards principles and processes and why it's important that we're all considering this very important topic today. So I'd like to hand back to Chris and sit back and enjoy the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. And on behalf of LGPro, I add to those words of welcome and underscore the importance of the topic that we're going to explore today. We have a number of CEOs with us. We do have a number of councillors elect, including some very excited first-time councillors about to be taking office, which is great to see. And of course, a lot of governance professionals are with us and interested in this conversation today. So as Catherine has said, the results of the council elections have been coming through this week. I understand as of a short while ago, we've got about 80% of results through, and some interesting statistics coming out of that. Now is perhaps not the space to be unpacking all of that. But CEOs and governance teams are preparing for the important induction process that is about to kick off in earnest. A key area for focus will be building understanding in relation to the governance responsibilities that go with the role of the councillor, such as personal interest returns, understanding the conflict of interest regime, the new standards of conduct that underpin the required councillor code of conduct for each council. To help us explore these and related issues, we're thrilled to have a highly experienced and qualified panel with us today. I'll introduce each briefly and then we'll spend a couple of minutes with each of our panellists. Firstly, John Lynch, who is the Acting Chief Municipal Inspector from the Local Government Inspectorate. John, thank you for your time today. It is always great to get your insights on these topics, and we look forward to hearing from you in just a moment. Ross Millard, who's the Manager of Operations at the Local Government Inspectorate, is with us as well, and a wealth of experience to draw on in relation to these issues. Blaga Naumoski, who is the Executive Manager of Governance, Communications and Engagement. I hope I got that right, Blaga, at Nillumbik Shire Council, will give us her perspectives. And as Catherine mentioned, Stephen Cooper from Civic Mind and the VLGA is part of our panel today as well. So let's get started with some questions. And John, I'd like to come to you first, John and Ross, for your insights. What do you think governance people need to be doing right now to get off to the best possible start with their incoming councillors?
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for that introduction and for the invitation to attend today. Look, today's session is particularly timely, and of course you've referred to the very recent local government elections. And we have a new set of governance and integrity regulations that came into effect on the same day as the elections, and also not forgetting that on the 24th of October, roughly a third of the new 2020 Local Government Act also commenced. So we had those new provisions dealing with 4 key areas around mayors, deputy mayors and councillors, around strategic planning, budget processes and reporting, and around council integrity and ministerial oversight. So the theme of governance certainly fits in with those new provisions that are just pretty much off the shop floor. Before I get on to dealing with what I think governance officers need to get right with their incoming councillors, I'll just give you a very quick overview of the role of the Local Government Inspectorate. This may be particularly of interest to new councillors and people who may not have otherwise come across our work. But the Local Government Inspectorate is set up under the Local Government Act. Its core business is around investigating offences under the Act and examining possible breaches of the Act. So, for example, in the recent local government elections, under Part 8 of the Local Government Act, there are over 20 election-related offences, mostly regulatory in nature, but also some quite serious, like bribery and interfering with postal ballots, strangely enough. In addition to those functions of breaches of the Act and offences under the Act, the Inspectorate can now also investigate public interest disclosures. So the 2020 changes to the whistleblower protections means that we can now investigate public interest complaints. And we've developed a very close working relationship with IBAC in order to be able to do that, to get the referrals right and to get the investigations underway. Now, in addition to those two functions, we have the incidental functions of monitoring activities in the local government sector. So, for example, the integrity of the candidate nomination process recently in the elections, and compliance, and things like, as Chris mentioned, the personal interest returns, and upcoming we'll be looking at the election donation reporting requirements as they start to come in. So I think there are probably 2 aspects that I see for governance officers to get off to get off on the right foot with their councillors. First of all, I think it's absolutely essential that governance officers and councillors are across the technicalities within the Local Government Act. So generally, I understand that the 2020 Act is less prescriptive than the 1989 Act, but all the same, it does provide a highly structured compliance regime. And I think there are probably 7 key provisions that you should be aware of, certainly for the purposes of today's discussions. And they are the overarching principles and the 5 supporting principles in Section 9 of the Act, the role of councillors in Section 28 of the Act, and just for the benefit of everyone here, I suppose I'll just draw your attention to Section 28.3, which states that the role of councillors does not include any responsibility or function of the CEO. In other words, there's a clear delineation between the role of councillors on the one hand and the role of CEOs on the other. The explanatory memorandum for the Local Government Bill makes it clear that the role of a councillor, for example, does not include staffing matters which are the responsibility of a CEO. Moving on, section 32 deals with the induction training for councillors, read with Regulation 6.2 of the new Governance and Integrity Regulations, which sets out the matters which must be prescribed in the training. Section 60 which deals with governance rules, which I'm sure you're all aware of, because of course they all have to be in place by the 1st of September. The whole of Division 2 of Part 6 of the Act, which deals with conflicts of interest, but particularly sections 127 to 129, which contain the distinction between general and material conflicts of interest, read with Regulations 7.1 and 7.2, which set up the prescribed matters which can be exempted from the conflict consideration in relation to councillor decisions. Moving on, sections 133 to 135 deal with personal interest returns, read with Regulations 8 to 10, which set out the prescribed content for the returns and the CEO summaries that will go up on the website. I'll also refer you to the Local Government Guide on the new return arrangements, which contain some really useful FAQs and some model interest return form, a model interest return form, which I'd certainly encourage all councils to at least have a look at. And finally, there's section 139, which is the new councillor code of conduct, read with Regulation 12 and the schedule to the Governance and Integrity Regulations, which prescribes the minimum content for councillor code of conduct. And no doubt you're all starting to think about that, because of course they all have to be in place by February next year. So that's the first thing, the first aspect, that you know, it's the technical side of what the framework looks like. But I think it's absolutely, the second part, it's absolutely essential that governance officers can authoritatively tell councillors why the rules are in place. So governance and compliance systems don't exist in a vacuum. They're in place, I think, in the Local Government Act to ensure that public confidence is maintained in the essential work of the local government sector, particularly in relation to the decision-making process. So this is never a form-filling or tick-the-box exercise. When you're doing your annual, your biannual personal interest returns, you have to think about them. You have to think about them carefully. They have to be accurate, and they have to be in on time. So for councillors, the governance system in the Local Government Act, I think, reinforces the absolute primacy of their responsibility to serve the community. There are provisions in the Act, like section 28(1)(b), which requires councillors to represent the interests of the municipal community. And municipal community is defined quite broadly in the Local Government Act in quite an interesting way. For council staff, the governance arrangements reinforce their role in ensuring that councillors are aware of that responsibility, both to, I think, their local community and the broader local government sector. So from my point of view, there are the two things. There's the technical side of it, but there's also the need to understand why it's there, why it's in place.
Thanks, John, for that intro. Before I move on to Blaga, this might be one for Ross. In terms of all those issues you've raised, and personal interest returns was one, what does your experience or your observations tell you about where it's been deficient in the past in terms of attending to these requirements?
Could I make a general comment first? And it's probably glib, but the tone is set from the top. Like, you know, we look at it across a lot of organisations, and things are done much better if there's an emphasis from the CEO and the corporate management team to actually support the governance officer. Now, that's just a general statement, but we've just done some recent work with returns of interest from last period, and we actually looked at over 600 councillors and quite hundreds and hundreds of pages of returns of interest. And the reality was of the 300, of the 600 councils, 300 had issues with them, properties left out, inconsistencies from one return to the next, confusion with the difference between a conflict of interest and a declaration of an interest. And some of the feedback we got in some survey work we did from candidates was they felt like the training was given at the start of the period and wasn't reinforced through the council period. But I know that's not universally the case, but I suppose the other thing that came back was that some of them didn't feel supported by the governance officers. They felt like they needed a proactive approach to in assisting them with the returns. And I suppose that's just one element of it, but that's what we've got. Recently, I suppose the other thing is, obviously we've dealt with a lot of election complaints. Now, I don't know if this sets the tone for the election period, but in 2016, we got 409 complaints. This year, we've got over 760. We're up 87%. So I suppose I hope it's not reflective of what's going to come in the next council period.
Oh, we would all echo that, Ross. It is a worrying trend. I want to pick up on a theme you've introduced there around the proactive role of the governance officer, proactive or hands-off, because there are two schools of thought about this, and this is where I might bring in Blaga and Steve. So Blaga, firstly, how do you balance that role of providing guidance to councillors while making sure that they ultimately understand that the responsibility does rest with them?
I think essentially it's important for governance officers to understand the complex environment that we're in, but very much be clear about their role as that is an advisory role, and we should go beyond the legislation and the rules that are established through the Local Government Act. My approach, and one that is supported by our council and our CEO and executives, is to set the expectations from the beginning, apologies, and to support the councillors beyond their minimum standards. I think, from my opinion, our role should be to provide frank and fearless advice to the council and to provide practical examples of how to support the councillors in their decision making. An example that Ross provided when it comes to completing register of interests, it's not enough just to give them the form and to let them go with their own devices. I think it's important that we provide the guidance material. We offer them time to be able to discuss each of the questions and provide practical examples of how they can apply or answer those types of questions. I think it's remembering that even with protocols and policies in place, there is not a rule for every situation, and good governance also relies on our good judgment. How
important is it from the outset to be building that trusted advisor relationship, do you think, with incoming councillors?
I think it's fundamental, definitely. I think it's important that we've got a perfect opportunity now with a new council and an induction and a mandatory induction training program to instill that from the day we start or they start. It's fundamental for the relationship, to building good relationships and to building respect, because when you have those fundamental, ideas, they do have the ability to come to you for all those types of questions. And having the support of your CEO and clear expectations of our role as a governance team and governance advisors, that's critical, because there's not that, unexpected, who do we go to for those types of questions, and it provides that the support to the CEO as well.
Thanks, Blaga. I'll come back to you shortly. I want to bring Steve into the conversation. It's so important, Stephen, as Blaga was saying, to start as you intend to finish effectively, because the absence of that trusted relationship can lead to a breakdown and a them and us type of environment. I know you and I both have seen that happen in the past. Where would you start, do you think, with building that understanding, that relationship with councillors?
I think Blaga and John and Ross have really touched on a recurring theme around the fact that compliance isn't enough. And I think a constant reminder of that is important. It's probably worthwhile taking a step back, particularly for for example, new councillors, because, you know, what are we talking about when we talk about governance? And fundamentally, it's how does the organisation make decisions? And then we might talk about corporate governance, which is, you know, what are the laws, the rules, the processes and procedures of the organisation, which I think, you know, in Blaga's frame is that, you know, that's our minimum standard. But without the trust that Blaga and John particularly talked about, we don't then move to good governance. We don't move to quality communication. That means that all of the issues are on the table and the best decisions are made. And in the absence of that, for example, I don't know if you'd like to talk about it, Chris, but we can't help a councillor deal with, for example, conflict of interest advice if there's not the trust between the parties to ensure that as much information as possible is available. So coming back to that recurring theme of, and again, not just what's in the Act, but why, you know, having something in your armoury that explains the purpose and the reason, because most of what's in the Act is just good governance. It's just because things have happened in the sector, the parliaments over time have felt the need to legislate accordingly. So a really deep understanding, I think, is important, Chris.
Yes, agree, Steve. I just want to remind folks in the audience to use the chat function to ask your questions, because I'll be looking to come to your questions very shortly with the panel. You've just introduced the conflict of interest part of this, and, you know, we talked about personal interest returns, fundamentally linked, obviously, to the clarity around conflict of interest. Steve, I put it to you that the sector has gotten very good, or the governance people have gotten very good at reminding councillors that it's their responsibility to understand whether they've got a conflict or not. They can't be told by anyone else. But this goes to this issue around having that relationship where you can seek advice, you can have the conversation and be trusting that you're getting the right guidance towards being able to make your own decision.
Absolutely, Chris. And there's so many dimensions to that too, because as we know from time to time in the governance role, part of that role is around delivering bad news to councillors. You know, just keeping you safe, councillor, but if you go down that path, there is potentially a consequence. So part of the trust is about understanding what the intention is of the conversation and where do we want to get to. Who are the stakeholders involved? Now, conflict of interest is important because ultimately that really reflects the trust that the community has in the organisation to know that decisions are made in the absence of a conflict of interest. The 2020 legislation's been a real game changer in that point because in some ways, some of us that have been around for a while quite like the 1989 legislation because even for its impurities, it was absolutely clear. You know, you went through the process and ticked the box and you came up with an answer as to whether a conflict existed. I don't actually think it was always the best answer, but it was a clear answer. So the new legislation really requires an understanding of a material conflict where there's money involved, a general conflict where a reasonable person might think that a decision's been influenced by the relationship. And I come back to the point that Blaga made earlier, that it's going to be really important not only to have the purpose of that being clear between the parties, and understanding that stakeholders of the organisation are vitally interested in the decisions that are made, but also a toolkit of examples of what falls inside and outside a conflict of interest as far as is possible.
I was just interested, Steve, in your reflection on the 1989 Act and the fact that it was so prescriptive. And what you're talking about is this moving beyond compliance to understanding why it is that it's important that we behave in a certain way. And I think fundamentally that you've nailed it, because in fact, if we don't understand why it's important to behave in a certain way and move beyond what is minimum compliance, we will then be back in a situation where we have to have a prescribed rule for everything. And of course, that's logistically not possible. So I think, you know, that concept of understanding why it's important to move beyond compliance can't be overstated. I think that we really, and I'd be interested in the panel's thoughts on that. And I know Ross touched a little bit on that also.
I'll kick it off if you like, Catherine. My inner bureaucrat really appreciated the 1989 Act. The part of me that is around the ethics and the principles of the way we work really supports the 2020 legislation because it goes to the essence of decision making. But like most, a lot of ethical questions, it is difficult when it gets hard, and that's the time when good decisions are required. But that's where, if the sector is to progress, we really need to be able to make decisions in that frame.
My observation of the conflict of interest regime is that every time there was an attempt to simplify it or make it clearer, it actually made it more complex on the ground. This is a very big quantum shift, really, under the new Act, isn't it? I'm interested in views from anyone on the panel on whether they see this as a practical way of managing conflict of interest going forward. John?
Yeah, I think I'd probably agree with you, Chris. I think that the approach in the 89 Act was, you see a hole, you deal with it by legislation, but it's this constant sort of whack-a-mole approach to trying to deal with particular situations. I'm actually reasonably optimistic about the new provisions in Part 6 of the Act dealing with conflicts of interest as much as anything else, because I think the regulations are actually quite well drawn. So when you do your personal interest returns now, you'll actually have to think about a lot more than you did previously. And it actually will steer you, I think, in the direction of, where a conflict is likely to sit, and more particularly, how you're going to manage that conflict through the decision-making process.
So that does bring us back to that issue of equipping councillors to work through that process and understand, what's required to do it properly. Blaga or Steve, where do you start with equipping councillors for that task?
I think, as I mentioned earlier, opportune time for an induction training to have really stringent program in place and to really emphasise the importance of compliance, but also practical tools that they can rely on to be able to make their decisions and act in their role. But it doesn't just stop at just inducting them and then, here you go, here's a manual and here's some tools and off you go. I think it's really important that there's an ongoing communication, ongoing relationship with the councillors, providing them opportunity to reach out and continually learn and grow as situations arise and as different scenarios are brought to their attention. So it's over a 4-year period. You continually train them and provide them opportunities to be able to do their role.
Which would address the issue that Ross mentioned earlier about being told up front what's required, but then sort of being left to your own devices, and then it can potentially go off the rails. Steve?
And agree completely with Blaga. Behaviour science tells us that most people want to do the right thing, and that we should be designing systems to help people to do the right thing. And there can be a tendency, and we've got to address, the breaches and the reasons for people to do the wrong thing, but there can be a tendency to focus on that compliance and punishment element, when really what we should be doing early is making sure that people are well trained and alert to the issues, that we've got the systems and the supports in place to help people make good decisions. And picking up from something John said, I really like the way the standards of conduct are framed, that we should be seeing ourselves as supporting a council where the reputation of the council is important, and trust and reputation is supported by being nervous about and making declarations on conflict of interest. So design of systems important, framing is important.
Yes, just on that, Steve, I think that issue of training is a really important one too, because I think what this new legislation will do is change some of the way in which the training, induction training may have been thought about and delivered in the past. There'll be those core elements, of course, which are mandated, the absolutely clear do's and don'ts, but I think what the training will also need to cover is some of those softer elements of the framing and the discussions around behaviour and why it's important that we behave in certain ways and consider certain aspects when it comes to decision making. And I think that's an important takeaway for CEOs and governance teams in the room, because I think the sector will only evolve to, I guess, that way of operating consistently, I'm not saying that that doesn't happen now, but more so across the board, if the conversations happen regularly. Why is it important that we do this? How are you thinking through the issues that are in front of you? What are you taking into account when you enter into a deliberation? What are you leaving outside of the council chamber? What are you bringing into the room with you? And for all of us, we only learn to think that way when we repeat the behaviours, when we repeat the conversations.
I want to take it perhaps in a slightly different direction. We're talking about personal responsibilities here of councillors to understand obligations and meet them. What's the role of the mayor in that environment? Do we have any thoughts on that?
I think it's extraordinarily important for the mayor to understand. I mean, it's been strengthened in the Local Government Act, the 2020 Act, around what the mayor's responsibility is. And fundamentally, I think it's around exhibiting the good governance behaviour and holding the councillors to account when they do go outside of that. But it's continually having those conversations with your colleagues around what is appropriate. The respect and the reputation of council really relies on the way that we behave publicly, and that anything outside of that will ensure that the community knows that as a council we have their best interests at heart. And that we're doing everything possible beyond just the good governance principles. We're really doing things, to the best of our ability. So I think the role is extraordinarily important. But as governance advisors, we should also be there to support that the mayor in their role, and understand that as community members who have been elected, they may not have the understanding of what their responsibilities are, and at different levels they have knowledge and skill sets that may be different from those that have had ongoing council roles in the past. So it's having those clear expectations and being there to provide that type of advice.
The Act does talk about the mayor having the responsibility to promote the standards of conduct that are expected amongst the councillor cohort. So what about the mayor receiving advice, guidance and training on that issue? Is that a separate piece of work to working with the rest of the councillors?
Blaga's nailed it, that the role of the mayor as set out in the Act is absolutely critical in terms of addressing, and I'd also emphasise, dealing early with issues before they become conduct breaches, if you like. Another part of that role I would have thought also is that every council I know, the mayor meets regularly with the CEO, and that's a really good opportunity for both the elected and the administrative side of the organisation to deeply understand culture, to understand communication and ways of working inside the organisation. And there's a gold mine in those, coming out of those conversations for governance staff to really get a sense of whether we've just got policy on paper or whether policy has been effectively deployed through the organisation.
Well, just very briefly, and I'll just refer back to the session last week. I think it was Peter Stevenson who made the very good point that mayors are there about creating the expectations for the standards of behaviour, which is, I think, pretty much the point that Steve has just made as well. But it's also critical that mayors lead the council in terms of an understanding of their role under the legislation. I come back to the point that I made in my introductory comments about the clear delineation between the staff of the council on the one hand and the council laws on the other. And the CEO is the link, I guess, between the mayor and the councillors on the one hand and the staff. So the idea that Steve mentioned of CEOs meeting regularly with their mayors and the mayors being critical to the setting of standards certainly resonates with me.
Interesting that you raised that CEO role, because that was going to be one of my follow-up questions around, we're talking about the role of the governance professional. We haven't really distinguished whether that's a manager governance, whether that's the director with responsibility for governance or the CEO. I mean, who are we talking about there? And should there be a distinction between the level of responsibility those roles take with regard to these governance processes?
I think internally, and it would be really interesting to see the feedback from John and Ross of what they observed, but also Blaga's direct feedback. That conversation about who's responsible for governance inside the organisation, I think, is a really important one. That you know, the notion that governance is everyone's responsibility, but also that the governance team have particular responsibilities, really needs to be fleshed out inside the organisation, because the topic can't reside with one person or group. It needs to be, as I said, effectively deployed. But happy to take some comment from others on that.
I was just interested in Blaga's reflections, and even any other governance or people or CEOs in the room. How much time is spent in the induction of a new councillor group who've just come off the back of potentially campaigning on single policy issues, which of course they won't have any power to implement necessarily once they are elected and in the council chamber? Is there much time spent on, I guess, disavowing those councillors' thoughts on that?
I guess from my experience and from what we've developed an induction program, which is quite wide-reaching. It's got various levels of, I guess, topics that we wanted to explore. But I think fundamentally it's about understanding the role as a councillor is an individual councillor. So explaining that very clearly from the get-go, and understanding that decisions are made collectively. So once that is instilled in the council group, it's up to the individual councillors to, you know, collectively join their forces and understand what's important. And that role of developing a council plan is probably the best mechanism for them to be able to have their voice and to have the collective sort of support of all their councillors, because it's one council, not individual councillors. So that's fundamentally important from my perspective, is having that conversation right at the start of their induction.
Yes, and I guess that also then goes back to the role of the mayor in leading that coming together of the councillor group. Chris, we do have a couple of questions coming in now, if you'd be happy. I'll just go over to Di Bell in Horsham. The question essentially says that she understands the importance of the code, but the current code is based on the 1989 Act. And is it normal to sign the code as part of the oath? So that's a sort of a procedural question, which I guess I'll hand over to the panel to answer.
I'd need to go back and look at the provisions relating to the oath in the new Act. You certainly do have to get a new code of conduct together under the new legislation. That's got to be in by, I think, the end of February, or
within 4 months, I believe. Yes.
Yeah. But the code also has those provisions relating to, well, the prescribed components within the regs. And look, I don't know whether how much or to what extent that actually overlaps with the old code or the expectations, but that should at least provide you with the basis for proceeding.
Steve, the process is different this time around. So my simple take on this is that councillors are expected to sign the existing code once they take the oath, but they have 4 months to develop their own code that takes into account the new standards of conduct and a range of things that the regulations have set down. Is that too simplistic a take on it?
I think the important part, Chris, is that new councillors are going to need to follow the current code until the new code is adopted. The signing question's not one I've particularly looked at, but the sector, there's a rich history of whether the code should be signed or not. I think signing the code is probably not a bad idea to make sure everyone's seen it and it's got the attention.
And some of us have had our fingers burned around oath taking and complying with the letter of the Act. And while I'm no longer in that particular role, I wouldn't want to go through that again.
No.
Catherine.
Chris, Denise Missard has also, I guess, made a comment here about the campaigning activities that she has recently observed. Denise, did you want to talk to that point?
Yeah, look, there have been some interesting, I suppose, challenges across a few councils where it has been exceedingly negative. I've not seen that before. So this is my third term that I'll be doing. But and it was really quite targeted and negative. And I would say probably council bashing as well, and not exactly accurate. But my concern is we've got, and some will get over the line. I saw some of the negative campaigning actually resonating with the community. And my concern is they will come on as new councillors, and they've come from a very small community group. And I think they believe that that's how it's going to work, and we're going to be in there and we're going to be going, you know, having those stoushes in the chamber. And yet we're talking about the behaviour we need to develop a strong sector where people work together respectfully, etc. And so I guess my point is that the Mayor and the CEO really need to sort that out very quickly, because we don't want to go down that unpleasant path at the beginning.
That's a good comment, Denise, and relates a little to what I was talking about earlier. And I guess this has been the first social media election as well. So there'll be some interesting, I guess, challenges and opportunities that come off the back of that.
Can I just make one comment?
Please, Ross.
I suppose one of the main things that we find is there's got to be from a councillor, there's got to be a willingness to accept training, and there's got to be guidance. I mean, you know, we've done quite a few interviews over the years in terms of conflict of interest, and one of the first questions we asked is, what sort of training have you had? And what do you understand about the Local Government Act? And you may get, and this is generalisation, you may get an experienced councillor that says, oh, look, I know all about conflict of interest. I haven't been to the training for the last 2 terms, but I do know about it. And because what first thing we'll do is we'll tell us about this scenario, and it's quite clear that they haven't got that knowledge, and they haven't been willing or receptive to the training. And it's going to be more important this year. And I don't know if LGV's released their guide yet. I'm not sure, but it's quite good in taking with a number of different scenarios. But you've got to be willing to accept the guidance, accept the training, and have it reinforced over time. That's just a statement, really.
No, good advice, good observation, Ross. I've had a pre-submitted question, which I want to try and summarise, and it's around a councillor-elect that has an existing relationship with the council they've been elected to through a private business interest. There's concern from other councillors, as I understand it, and residents about that being a conflict of interest, and also I think a genuine concern that councillor might be constantly out of the chamber, out of the voting process because of that conflict of interest. So that's a very brief summary of what is sounds to be a complex issue. But Steve, I think this probably brings us back to the principles and process question, doesn't it, about how you work through an issue like that?
I think it does, Chris, and hopefully would address any councillor's mind. That wouldn't be the first time we've heard that a councillor-elect has had previous business dealings with a council. That's not unusual.
And in this case, a business dealing that is expected to continue.
Yeah. But I guess the point I was making is that anyone thinking of standing for council would want to be clear in the first instance that doesn't fatally flaw their capacity to act as a councillor. Now that's not written down anywhere, because the part that's written down is if there's a matter where the business interest and the decision of the council overlap, there's a need to declare and act on the conflict of interest. The principle is the bigger one around what's the trust of the community in that person's capacity to act as a councillor, and in the reputation of the organisation more generally.
Yeah, spot on.
I just suppose that the difference is there's an interest, but it's not actually a conflict of interest until it's related to a particular decision or consideration. So the person or the councillor needs to be able to manage that interest, and that's where they need to take the training and take the guidance of the governance officers and the CEO and other staff.
Yep, good point. And going back to something that Catherine was talking about before with one of the submitted questions, I'm reminded that the reason we have the new regulations on standards of conduct and these requirements that those be the minimum elements of a code of conduct is because the new local government minister has said very clearly conduct and behaviour of councillors is at the top of his list of priorities to monitor and address. He's said it very bluntly to me, dissatisfied with the stories he's hearing about behaviours that have been occurring around the sector and wants to do something really meaningful and constructive to raise the level of and standard of behaviour. So I guess that's a comment from me, but Catherine, I think it's a really relevant one.
Oh, look, it is, Chris, and certainly the Minister has talked to me about that also, and unfortunately has himself been subject to direct behaviours that have been less than ideal from councillors who have felt unhappy for whatever reason about the progress of the legislation or a decision, and yet chose to express their dissatisfaction in ways which one would say is not the acceptable way to enter into negotiations and deliberations.
Yeah.
So it is certainly a matter that is of concern, but also we look at the fact that we've got 76 councils instead of 79 that have gone to election this year, and there's some very concerning reasons as to why those 3 other councils have not. So I think that's a relevant point, Chris, that you make.
And also to see other jurisdictions, not just in Australia. There's a pretty big one playing out across the Pacific at the moment, where behaviours have been really appalling, and they're still resonating with the vote. I'm really getting on my soapbox today, but you know, what hope have we got when this stuff is reinforced and confirmed? And I think social media is playing a big role in the dissemination of that as well. Very interested in any comments people might want to make on those issues. I think we're out of questions, but I did want to go back to an issue that John raised very briefly at the outset, and that is around election donation reporting requirements. It's another important governance task, but it's a task that, unlike all of those others, sits with every candidate that has participated in the process. John or Ross, any comments on what you're looking for there, and how confident are you that everyone's going to get this right?
Experience would tell us that, for a start, we're not going to get 10% of campaign donations. We've started a communication plan with candidates and with governance officers and CEOs, and we'll be continuing that over the next 40 days or whatever. But it's some of the issues that we've had in the past, where councillors or candidates were unsure where to lodge a return. I know they've had plenty of information about with the CEO, but some that we investigated in the past, they failed to, they said that they'd put it into the council, and by all accounts they said they'd put it into the council and had just gone in with some general documents and was lost within the council. I suppose that have a designated area or designated process to receive the campaign donations. I think in the past we've had over 200 that hadn't submitted them on time, and of that, you know, and we will go back to them, use the candidates a number of times, but invariably we prosecute, which we don't want to necessarily do, but we prosecute probably 20 of those. So 10% that haven't, because even though you remind them, they still don't submit. And it's important, it needs to be emphasised, and they need to submit. So we're trying to make contact with them, but I suppose councils need to be aware of it too in terms of receiving them. Have they got a designated email, particularly in the current environment, or is there a particular way it can be identified at the council?
Yeah, so we were aware of the campaign that the Inspectorate had started in regards to promoting the requirement, and so we took the proactive approach as well and sent an email out to all the candidates, just reminding them of their responsibilities and the requirements to lodge those, and provided a central governance email I think the confusion is that it says, provide it to the CEO. So although the central email was there, we have predominantly had them to our CEO, but I guess open communication with our CEO and understanding of us being able to collect them and register them and all those types of things. We've been able to sort of keep on top of that, and it's foolproof, but there are sometimes that others can slip through, but I think that's a really good way to just to be clear about where those forms go, just central email, and then being very clear to our corporate information or our records department, look out for these types of things that may come in the mail and who to direct them to.
Thank you, Blaga. Catherine, I think we might have completed our questions, so perhaps we look to start wrapping up. I know the lunch hour's nearly gone and some people need to leave. So I might just come to each panel member just for a takeaway thought message around focus at this particular time in relation to governance. John, firstly, thank you again. What are you hoping people are thinking about and doing right now?
Well, based on today's discussions, I certainly hope they're thinking about forming an absolutely fabulous relationship with their incoming councillors so that they understand what their compliance and governance responsibilities are under the new legislation. So you know the Act and know what it's there for. Ross?
Be respectful, accept training, accept that you may need guidance. I suppose they're the main things that I'd emphasise.
Very, very succinctly put. Thank you. And Blaga?
I guess from my perspective, it's ensuring the organisation understands the importance of compliance and good governance, and promoting and taking a leadership role in modelling the culture of good governance and commitment, showing commitment to those characteristics. Because by doing that, we're then instilling those types of practices and principles onto the councillors. So taking an active role.
Thank you, Blaga. And Mr. Cooper?
I think the first one is that what might be underestimated is with the change to a principles-based act, some of the biggest learnings and unlearnings will be from existing councillors who might be blindsided otherwise because, what we've always done might not be okay. The other one, we haven't just had a chance to touch on it, but one of the really big risks for conduct issues is rationalising poor behaviour because someone else does it. It's not that serious. Spending time on unpicking common rationalisations is usually time well spent and creates some good stories in the organisation.
And Catherine, final thoughts?
In terms of, where we could go from here for those people who are in the room, we're really keen to hear from you as to what aspects, of this discussion that we could perhaps dig into in a deeper way. We're really keen to collaborate in an ongoing way with other agencies such as the Inspectorate, IBAC, and of course other organisations such as LGPro. So we're really here to support you on your journey of implementing and maintaining effective local governance. That's the role of the VLGA, and we're really keen to hear from you as to how we can do that in ways that are useful for you. I'd really like to thank, though, all of you in the room for your commitment today. We did have 82 registered for this event, so whether some of those perhaps may have been candidates who've received some bad news recently and decided that they might go for a walk instead of join us today, or others might be stuck watching the US election, which of course is going on at this moment. And if I might just talk to that, there was a fabulous webinar series facilitated by the University of Melbourne and Professor Tim Lynch. You can probably go back and see those 4 webinars of 45 minutes each, which were just incredibly interesting in so much as not just looking at the US system, but democracy generally globally, and the learnings that we ourselves can take away from that at a local government level. Thank you, Chris, again for your excellent moderation, and to our panel for joining us today.
Thank you, Catherine. On that point about registrants, what we are finding with our sessions is we're getting a lot of registrants who don't come at the time because they're planning to watch it back because they know there'll be a recording version and they can watch it on their own time, that's the way to get first access to that, which is perfectly valid as well. So on that note, a recording of today's session will be available soon, and all registrants will be sent information on how to access that in the next day or so. So it leaves me to thank you, Catherine, as well, for once again partnering with us at LGPro with VLGA on this session, which is a really worthwhile thing to do, I think. And thank you to John Lynch, Ross Millard, Blaga Naumoski and Steve Cooper for being an excellent panel. Thank you to each and every one of you in the audience for your participation today. We hope to see you on a future discussion very soon, and remind you of our VLGA Connect series of webisodes and podcasts. The most popular one, the one that everyone wants to know, when's the governance update coming out? Today's governance update will be out in about 2 hours, and you'll see that on YouTube or podcast with Mr. Stephen Cooper, of course. So remember to subscribe to those, and we look forward to seeing you again very soon on another live panel. Thank you and good afternoon.